Madam Vice President, are you ready for me to call roll?
I am.
Thank you. Trish Bodie,
Here.
Gloria Gonzalez Delakia,
Here.
Alexis Grimes,
Here.
Aaron Johnson, Jim McKay, Christine Maurer,
Here.
Anna Smith.
Here. With the quorum of board members present, I now call this Leander ISD January 7th, 2021 board meeting to order. I do want to note that President Bodie and Trustee McKay are joining us virtually this evening, so hopefully everyone can see them on there. We don't have any citizen comments this evening, so we're going to move on. This evening, we do have a focused agenda. So that's agenda item 2A, evaluating and improving student outcome training. We'll go ahead and go to that. Dr. Ardberg.
Thank you. Dr. Ardberg.
Thank you, Dr. Gearing, Dr. Delakia. Thank you so much for having me. As you know, my name is Laura Lynn Arterberry. I serve as one of our area superintendents, but tonight I get to serve as your trainer for the Senate Bill 1566, Evaluating and Improving Student Outcomes Training. This was a required training that came around back in 2017, I believe. And so our entire board of trustees went through that. Dr. Matt Smith and I were able to lead it. And then when Dr. Delakia and Ms. Grimes joined, we were able to train them, and so now is our chance to make sure we have everybody up to date on this. My hope this evening is that it's not just me presenting, but you truly asking questions of each other and truly talking about what does evaluating student outcomes look like in Leander ISD. The information I'm going to present you tonight is a very narrow focus, and so I just want to make sure we start with that conversation. It does not mean that it is inclusive of all ways in which we measure student outcomes. So hopefully everyone is on the Join PD. Ms. Bodie and Mr. McKay, were you able to log in to Join PD? Perfect. Awesome. Okay, so my first question for you before we get started here is, can you tell me two things that you already know about tonight's topic? And when you go to your screen on the bottom left, there should be a couple of tools. One's a highlighter, one's a marker, one's a text box. You can type anything in there you'd like, and just kind of let's start with what do we know about tonight? Why are we here? Senate Bill 1566. You're good. No worries. The T for text box might be the easiest, and I appreciate y'all bearing with me here. We're trying to make this as interactive as possible. Yes, ma'am, I believe if you hit submit, it will show up. Let's see.
I have mine in there, but I don't see them on your board. No.
As with every good lesson, where you got to try it out right and then adjust as you go along. All right. Yes.
After you You just clicked in that space, and then, yeah, mine's in there. I can see it on my screen, but
Interesting. I apologize. We will keep going, and we may end up having to talk if it's not going to demonstrate up there for us. I'm sorry about that. Thank you. All right, so let's go ahead. I know you typed some things on there. Would you be willing to share, Ms. Maurer, what do you know about tonight's topic already?
Sure. The first one I put is that we're going to be talking about academic growth for our students. And the second one is there's typically 3 measures used: beginning of year, mid-year, and end of year when we talk about student benchmarks.
All right, thank you. Any other trustees like to share what they wrote?
I just put, it's a required training and allows us to look at these different benchmarks.
Yes, ma'am. Anyone else? Perfect. All right, so thank you. That just kind of helps me see it is definitely a required training, and it does help us look at how we measure student outcomes throughout the year. So we will move on to our next one. Hopefully this one will be interactive for you. The statement at the top says that student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. And so if you have the ability, I hope, to drag the blue dot where you might feel it is. All right. Would anyone like to comment on why they put their dot where they put it? Anyone? Sure. There seems to be a few in the agree, a couple in the middle, and some on the disagree. And again, there's no right or wrong answer here, just a statement about student outcomes.
I guess mine is very close to the agree, and I'm at, I think, what the educators and adults do around our students does impact their outcome. I don't have it all the way in agree because I do think that there are some students that are driven on their own, and regardless of what's happening around them, they're going to drive their own outcome. But I think for the most part, all the adult behaviors around them impact that, not only their teachers, but their administrators, their parents, their older, all the adults in their lives.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just on the agree side of the center line for similar reasons. I think we all recognize that the leadership that adults provide in this equation is really important. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that students have a role and a responsibility for their own learning. And even if the adults are doing all the right things, there's no guarantee that behaviors or outcomes will change. And so for me, that was sort of the balance.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing. I appreciate that, and I do know there's, yes, ma'am?
My apologies. Mine is the disagree. I got on to see if I could troubleshoot, so my apologies. The one near disagree does not count. I'm so sorry. I was going to troubleshoot.
I wasn't going to call anybody out if they disagreed. No, you're great. But I do appreciate your comments, because that's really what we're here to talk about tonight is how do our behaviors impact student outcomes? And like we said earlier in the evening, this truly is a very narrowed focused training. We're going to be looking at just a few things tonight, knowing that your role as a governance board is much more comprehensive than that. So really, why are we here tonight? And so what we're looking at is the framework for school board development. And Ms. Bodie and I were actually speaking about this prior to the break, and she had reminded me that this had recently been updated. So there's a link here to the most updated information as of November 20th, and it really talks about the role of your role as a governance team and how you are planning and looking at what student outcomes do we value here in Leander ISD, and then what systems do we set up to help monitor that progress. That could be a state accountability system, it could be national, it could be something that we believe in here locally. So really it's just your role and your partnership with Dr. Gearing and the entire community to help us provide those equitable and effective programs for all of our students. And so there's 5 portions to this, and Mrs. Bodie, please feel free to jump in. I know you're probably more familiar with this than I am. But really tonight, when I look at the vision and goals and what it outlines as your work as a board, I really want to commend you for your work on the core values that you've done recently and really looking at what do you believe and what do we believe here in Leander ISD are our core beliefs and our core values, because that sets the stage where we're going to go forward from here. It's hard to know where we want to go if we don't know what we all believe and if we don't have a common understanding. Tonight, we're really going to be kind of looking at some of those systems and processes and then that progress and accountability piece and talking about how can we take what we want as a student outcome and what we believe and then build a system that will help us measure that. And so one of the books that I was reading recently, and again, a recommendation from Mrs. Bodie, The Governance Core, talks about your role as a board of trustees, that you are a cohesive and unified team that work together for a common vision, and you're driven by a shared moral imperative. And that really resonated with me, that you have this common belief and this common moral imperative that's prompted you to take away time from your family and give back to your community and serve on this board. And so thank you so much for that. We know that governance is a key part of our system, and everything that we do revolves around the 7 of you sitting up here along with Dr. Gearing and our whole team. So thank you so much. Before we get started, just wanted to commend you for that. So Mrs. Bodie or any other trustees, was there anything else regarding the framework that you wanted to mention here?
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, there's a little bit of lag time, so I'll speak quickly and then be quiet. I just wanted to say, as we were talking about the updates on the framework, one of the things that kept resonating with trustees was locally developed. So I believe the discussion here helps lead more rich and robust discussions on what do we mean when we say locally developed, what are going to be our student outcomes that we're looking at. And then what I really enjoyed as I talked with other trustees is, we were undergoing the revisions for the framework and talking about different things of what these words mean to us. There were so many different discussions on how can you measure, what measurements will work, or why would you measure it this way, what one gives you overall knowing that your students are career and college readies, what ones are predictive versus what ones are measurements. So I'm looking forward to a robust discussion kind of tonight too, to hear what trustees are really wanting to lean into for our district.
Thank you so much for that, and I do want to just encourage you as we go through tonight, please, this is a training for you, and I want it to be beneficial for you. So as I'm here representing TEA providing this training, it does not mean that I have a script and I'll be going straight through it. So I'm going to provide a couple of prompts up there, but I really want you all as trustees of Leander ISD to engage in that conversation and talk about, just because the state accountability system says this, what do we believe, how do we feel, and like Ms. Bodie said, the locally developed piece of it I think is important, because what values we have in Leander ISD don't happen in other districts, and they're important to us. So thank you for that. All right, with that being said, there are some pieces of the training that we really have to cover, and so this is kind of one of those, the intended outcomes tonight is that we'll be able to, as a board of trustees, talk about inputs, outputs, and outcomes. These might also be known as lead and lag measures. There's many different ways we can look at them, but what do we know in our system that we can use to kind of measure student progress along the way? And then what is your role as a board of trustees? And where do you and Dr. Gearing work together and work with the administrative team to make sure we are achieving our outcomes? An overview of the state accountability system, and I'll give a disclaimer that I am not Brenda Cruz. I am not the Director of Assessment and Accountability, so she will be an expert for any specific questions, but my goal here tonight is to give you a high-level overview. And then again, really talking about your role as a board and setting those student outcomes that we believe in, and then helping us design a system to measure that. All right. So what we'll be talking about tonight is the, again, school boards matter, progress monitoring, accountability, and then implementation. Because we all know we can design a beautiful plan, we can have a beautiful vision, we can post it all over the walls, but if it doesn't actually come to life in our classrooms and with our students, then it's just some really beautiful words that didn't make an impact on our students. So that's really what we want to look at. Okay. So in 10 words or less, and my hope is that these will be able to appear, and you may have a piece of paper if you want to start there, but I'm really curious, what impact on students do you most hope to have had at the end of your time in this leadership role as a Board of Trustees member or superintendent? And I really encourage you, 10 words, it's hard. If you're like me, 10 is near impossible, but try to narrow it to 10, and then we'll share those. So hopefully you can see these on the screen. I'll start back up at the top. And if anybody'd like to share what they wrote and why they felt compelled to write that, please feel free to. All right, I'll give you all a chance to read these. So I'm curious what connections you see in what's written on the screen right now with the core belief work you've been engaging in as a Board of Trustees.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
So I'll jump in. So the one that's displayed on the screen right now, inspire students to explore their world through education, that was the one that I put down. And actually stole it back off of the core value work that we did earlier. But to me, that if you're looking at Erin and Gloria's point about the adults in the room can do all of the right things, but at the end of the day, the child needs to be inspired. So that's what I hope to leave my time on the board, is that somehow or other I have positively impacted students to inspire them to explore their world through education, not just simply show up to a school, do the minimum required to get through the day, but really develop a love for learning, lifelong learning.
Thank you, Mr. McKay, for sharing. I saw some of you reach towards your mic, so I was going to pause and see if there was any other comments.
Yeah, I see lots of connections to the core value work, which is fantastic. I also see and hear lots of connections to the hopes and dreams conversations that we had with the community before COVID hit us, and so that's powerful too.
All right, so now that we know what legacy we want to leave behind, we've seen alignment with our core values. The next question I have for you is, why do school systems exist? What's the purpose? We know what legacy we want to leave, what our intent is as leaders, but why do we have school systems? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. No, you're great. Take your time, please. You're great. No rush at all. Just trying to scroll through so y'all could see them. Anybody brave and willing to share their thoughts on why school systems exist?
I find it interesting because we know what we need to do for our communities, and school systems provide a very effective, efficient way to do that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the only way to do that or the best way to do that, I think.
All right. Great. All right, thank you very much for sharing. All right. Sorry, everything okay? Okay, perfect. All right. So as we stated in the last slide, there's a lot of reasons that that school systems exist, right? And I think it's easy for us to say what we want to do as an individual and what we hope to achieve as a governance team, but really trying to kind of quantify why we have school systems. And so I would argue that they represent the vision and values of their community. And I think we live in this community, and you all were elected by members of our community to represent Leander ISD. And so when we talk about our behaviors and what outcomes matter to us, that's where that locally developed piece comes in that we talked about earlier. And so again, tonight we're going to talk state accountability, but I really want to encourage you to think local as well as state and make sure that these are aligned. So the language that's used by TEA when we talk about outcomes is inputs, outputs, and outcomes. There's a lot of words on this screen. I apologize. Essentially, inputs are going to be something at the beginning of the cycle, something that we're going to put in. Outputs are going to occur in the middle of the cycle, and then outcomes are something that's going to occur at the end. We also have referred to these as lead and lag measures. Whatever we want to do, whatever you want to call them, whatever your comfort level is, TEA chooses inputs, outputs, outcomes. I can tell you these aren't words that I use every day, so please, if y'all have words that you're more comfortable with, or if Dr. Gearing has language that y'all have used regularly, please feel free to use that. So one of the examples, and I am by no means a gardener, I'm not quite the chef at all, but the example that I was thinking of trying to make a connection here was looking at gardening. So for those of you who may have a very bountiful garden, this may resonate with you. So when you look at the inputs that you put in, you have certain seeds, right? You want to grow certain fruits, vegetables. You have to make sure the water level's right. You have to put the time. The soil has to be the right balance. Everything has to be set up at the beginning if you want to get the intended outcome. And so in the middle of the cycle, some outputs, you're going to get certain fruits, certain vegetables. You're going to be able to repeat the process. And then at the end, the intended outcome would be that you have a sustainable garden that feeds your family. So this has nothing to do with education, but really just trying to get you to think that if our goal is a sustainable garden, we have to backwards plan that and think, what are those inputs that we want to put in, and what is that system that we want to design? So really that's what tonight is about, is for you as a board to talk about what is that garden, what is that end goal that we want to achieve, and then how do we kind of work backwards to make that happen? All right. So at this point, what I'd like you to do, and again, TEA's language is inputs, outputs, outcomes. And this slide right here looks at other outcomes and student outcomes. So I want to give you a chance to read that, and then I want to ask you, what's the difference between these two on the screen? What do you notice? And feel free to turn and talk. Mrs. Maurer, you can talk to me if you need to. Feel free to turn and talk with a partner if you need.
It occurs to me that the definition we see here of student outcomes is very narrow. And I understand, I think, the intent or the focus. The challenge is if we make it too narrow, then I don't know. I mean, I'll be honest, there's not a lot that I see in this definition that we could easily measure, right? If it's really limited to, exclusive of any other resource if it's limited to the student, because the student is a product of the system. And so I think it's an interesting distinction, but I struggle a little bit to understand what to do with it, right?
Okay. That's fair. I appreciate that. Other thoughts on this one? I think Aaron brings up a great point, and I think it is when you read through them, it is a very narrow focus. And I think honestly, between us and I guess whoever's watching at home, right, that's kind of my struggle with this training, is that it is a very narrow focus. All right, so when we go back and we look at inputs, outputs, outcomes, right, that seems to make a little bit of sense. I think where we seem to be, it's not quite as clear as on this, the other outcomes. So I'm curious, Mr. Johnson was brave and shared with us. Anybody else want to jump out there, and what do they see in these two, and how could we expand them?
Maybe just a quick follow-on too. I think one of the interesting things to consider in this context is what can be measured. And if you look at that universe of things that can be measured, or the measurements that can be taken, the observations that can be made, then we could start to talk about how pure they are in terms of student results versus system results. But I think in some ways this feels theoretically interesting, but practically when we start looking at what we can measure, we kind of have to, I don't know, look at it a little differently, I think.
Thank you.
When I look at this and I see outcomes are this measure, and I realize it is a TEA training, I get trapped in that we're measuring and we're looking at this thing that can be very easily measured, right? And there's a lot of other things that I want to look at, but I know, as you mentioned, that those other things are not so easy to measure. I want to know, are students happy? Are they inspired? Are they being challenged? All of those things, but on a scale and being able to easily quantify and measure that, it doesn't fit well into this definition and into this limited scope.
Thank you.
I agree with Gloria on that. There's much more to student outcome than just measuring how well they do on a particular task. What makes them happy? Are they good citizens? Are they contribute to the community? Do they have dreams for the future? How are they going to impact the world around them? These are things that we need to be measuring as well, not just, hey, what is it exactly that they know? Do they know this specific widget or whatever? As far as other outcomes, yes, there needs to be accountability in terms of tax rates and fiscal responsibility and all of the things that go into running the school district and providing that environment for the students to achieve those outcomes. But to Aaron and Gloria's point, the student outcomes that's listed is way too narrow.
Great. Thank you.
As y'all continue the conversation, I'd be interested to hear how squishy trustees are comfortable with measurements, right? Does it have to be exact measurement that we can do, or can it be something qualitative versus quantitative, right? Where are trustees' level of comfort as we're looking at measurements? Because I think the system that's designed in EISO is very narrow in focus. But if we broaden it, are we just talking about broadening measures, or are we also talking and broadening how we look at the measurements? Can they be qualitative and quantitative?
I think qualitative can be challenging in this environment. If we're talking particularly about student outcomes, that means that you're making a qualitative observation about every student or multiple aspects of every student's development, maybe not unlike a traditional report card like we know from decades ago with teacher comments and those kinds of things, right? And I think while those are useful, not suggesting they're bad, I just don't know how, I don't know what the application is in a system as large as ours to make those actionable, except maybe as it relates to students' progress from third grade teacher A to fourth grade teacher B or something like that. I don't know. But what that means for our system or at a board of trustees level, I'm not sure.
I think the word what did you say, Trish? How flexible we are on
Squishy.
Squishy. Okay. I'd say that I'm not going to use that word. I'm going to say I'm somewhat flexible there, but at the same time, I do have some of the same concerns as Aaron in terms of. I also think like sustainability, right? And from year to year, right? Even if it is at the end of third grade, it's someone's perception, and how does that move to the next year? And so, I mean, I'd love for us to talk about that and talk about other measures and things that we can have some flexibility on, and to look at some of those outcomes that would be considered more on the qualitative side. How do you make those reliable? How do you make those sustainable year after year?
And not only that, go ahead, Dr. Gehring.
No, please, Jim.
I was going to say, not only that, but each student learns and grows differently. Something that has always struck me is we provide individualized learning plans, but we teach to a test, right? So within the outcomes, it needs to be qualitative and quantitative, because it's ludicrous to think that every child who is age 8 is going to learn the exact same thing, the exact same way, at the exact same time. Some mature faster, some mature slower, some have higher ability than others. And the ones that don't have as high an ability academically may have a much higher capability artistically. So there's a lot that goes into, are we providing the best experience for our students, and are we giving the student, are we reaching them where they are at and helping them to get where they want to go? So
I think
extra thoughts there about students' outcome.
Thank you, Jim. I think Aaron made an important point earlier when he said that students have a role and responsibility in the learning. And I think for me, there's a huge paradigm of understanding where the responsibility for measuring outcome is as well. And so when you can shift some of that responsibility to students, then how they develop their own portfolios and explain and share their own performance and their own progress towards their own goals, then we really start to think about it differently and have an opportunity for the responsibility for this, which is overwhelming for teachers to do for individual kids. But if kids are doing it for themselves, and then we are finding ways to make sure that we can test the system's efficacy against that, then that, I think, becomes something that really works well.
Yeah, my comment was going to be about their graduate portfolio, and we're asking our students to be college, career, and military ready, and so if they're graduating with that portfolio and they have a list of their accomplishments, I think that helps us with our outcomes. We can kind of see their track and what their passions are and where they might wind up.
I was just thinking a little bit more about Trish's question. Maybe I internalized the question a certain way, and maybe you meant it another way, but qualitative research can still be statistical or numerical, right? But it tends to be opinion-oriented or perspective-oriented, survey-oriented, those kinds of things, as opposed to truly unstructured kind of narrative stuff, which could also be obtained through surveys and whatnot. But I think that latter group, the unstructured stuff, is useful for our system, but again, I don't know how we turn that into a reliable or dependable measure or indicator of student outcomes. I do think that perceptual data, that qualitative data, is an important component of what we're trying to do. We've talked about student voice and some other perspectives or paradigms around outcomes and results, and I think those are important references, but I think we've got to take it all together, right? The quantitative has to stand up on its own. If we succeed on the perceptual side, but we don't succeed on the quantitative side, that means we're telling ourselves we're doing a great job when in fact we're not. If we're doing really well on the quantitative side, but the perceptual side is suffering, that says that we're not doing it the right way, or we're putting results ahead of experience or something like that, right? So I think we have to find a way to balance those two things, but my earlier comments, I think, were focused more on the unstructured narrative information that we might struggle to utilize.
Yeah, I really like this input-output outcomes, because one of the things that attracted me to Leander ISD initially was the graduate profile, which is for me the outcome that we're expecting for our students in the district. And when you look at it, it's a two-page definition of multiple different things that includes what Erin is talking about, the numeric academic achievement of students, and then a myriad of other things, you know, under character development and effective, productive, and lifelong learning, and personal growth and expression, and social awareness, contribution, and stewardship. And so that for me is the outcome, right? That's what we're aiming for, this final goal of what does a graduate look like when they leave our system. And there's lots of outputs along the way that measure that, and all of them are important, and some of them are quantitative for sure, and some of them are qualitative.
Thank you so much for your comments. And Mr. Johnson, thank you for the clarification, because I think you're right. Sometimes we say the word qualitative and we think of it as the loosely defined, touchy-feely kind of qualitative, when you're right, there can definitely be qualitative data that we can measure and continue to look at sustainably over year. So I appreciate that very much. Thank y'all for sharing that. I apologize, that screen keeps popping up. There we go. What I'd like to do at this time is just kind of continue this conversation, because you're all on the right track. You're talking about what matters to you as a board, and that outcome may or may not be easily measurable. It may not fit in a pretty box that TEA gave us. It may be something that we have to talk about a little further. And so what I'd like for you to do is, you should have copies of 3 board agendas. And I randomly chose these, and I say randomly, there was a little bit of strategy. I chose one pre-COVID because I thought it might be back before COVID happened, right? So I picked one in February. I chose one in September that was right in the heart of COVID. We're trying to get schools open. And then I purposely chose November 19th because we had our 2 new trustees join us. You may choose any of these 3. I don't even know what was on the agendas. I just really tried to pick them. And knowing that the definitions, inputs, outputs, outcomes, Dr. Gearing just gave you a great explanation talking about our graduate profile as our final outcome, and all those outcomes, and then our outputs along the way. I really just kind of want you to grab a board agenda and just go through it. And what % of that board agenda do you think we spent talking about inputs, outputs, and outcomes? And just really kind of look at it. Just take a couple of minutes, and I'd love to get your feedback. Again, it's not scientific, just kind of based on those 3 conversations and knowing the importance of that talk. take about one more minute or so, and then we'll talk through this. All right. It's hard. When you're a teacher, you want to get up and move around and see what your students are doing. So it's really hard for me to sit at this table. I need y'all to know that. And silent. So I'm doing all I can over here. But so just kind of talk me through if somebody would be willing to share with us. You don't even necessarily have to share the date of the board meeting unless you want to. But just what did you notice about the agenda you looked at? And then were you able to find inputs, outputs, outcomes, or are they defined so tightly, as Mr. Johnson shared earlier, that it was hard to see anything? So just curious.
So within inputs, if we're talking about an input, and going back to your gardening analogy, we have to have a robust curriculum, we have to have the books, we have to have teachers. Those would all be part of the inputs. But having the lights turned on and having a building and having pencils and supplies and janitors and bus drivers, there's a lot. We would have to more clearly define what is an input, or for the sake of this exercise, right? But that being said, a lot of what we do in these board meetings, and President Bodie and I have talked about this before, ask the question, how does this impact students in the classroom? A lot of the things that we talk about don't impact students in the classroom. We talk, or if they do, it's so far removed that we spend far too much time talking about things that aren't really, how can we positively impact the student experience? That's my opinion on that. But I think in terms of strictly academic input, academic output, and academic outcomes, I think the percentages are pretty low, actually.
So the agenda that I picked, I noticed there was a lot of other outcomes because it was a heavy finance meeting. And so for me, at least, and again, I was kind of having the way I'm looking at input is, again, going back to your garden analogy. I am a gardener. I saw some inputs into this agenda. It's November 19th, which is probably the best meeting because we were sworn in that meeting. But I saw a lot more other outcomes, and what I consider their other outcomes is, the financial part of our district, and because we need to be financially stable to be able to provide the resources for our students. So for my agenda, I found a lot of OOs, and then for my input, the one thing I did find on there, which I feel is the core beliefs and commitment, because I feel like even though it's our core beliefs, we're still. For me, the way I'm looking at it is the Board of Trustees need to have, us group need to have a strong set of core beliefs, because then it trickles down and it sets a strong foundation. So that's the way I looked at it. So
I don't know if there's a right target for this, right? I don't know where we're supposed to be in terms of how we spend our time. For me, as I looked at one of our agendas, it felt, it confirmed to me that our time seems to be a little bit upside down in that the way I classified things, and admittedly this is highly subjective, but I felt like a lot of our time was spent on inputs, the vast majority of it on inputs. A little bit on some outputs, but very, very little on outcomes and less on student outcomes, right? So it felt upside down to me in that sense.
And thank you for sharing that. My next question was actually going to be, is there a right percentage? I don't know. I think that's what you as a board of trustees get to determine, right? When you come together once a month, twice a month, how do you want to spend your time? We heard Mr. Johnson say maybe it seems upside down if all we're talking about is inputs. I'd love to hear thoughts from others, because I don't have a formula. I'm not going to pop an answer up there, I promise. There are no numbers coming up there. This was truly just an opportunity for you all to discuss.
I think our agendas reflect kind of a COVID environment too. There's been a lot of looking at the inputs and outputs and system management, but I would like to see more items come up, like when you're saying, like, what do we think when we're looking at this? I'd like to see more discussions on student outcomes and these measurements and how we are measuring our learning. We've started those conversations, so I don't know if we're ready to have an action-packed agenda full of all the outcome information, but I do think and look forward to having our outcome measurements come up a little more.
I was going to say, I don't know if there is a right number, but like Erin, I started with one of the agendas, and after I did my little numbers here, I was like, oh, I don't like that. And I went and picked another one, because on that one, it was like, I felt 95 to 100% on the input side. So I said, no, I'm not going to pick that one. I will say, Trish, the one I landed on was pre-COVID. And I did feel like there was more output / outcome, and that was another part where I was like, is that an outcome, and or would we consider that an output, you know? And I'm looking at, and also thinking of things that are not academic in other spaces in regards to our previous conversation, looking at, for example, choir, you know, the all-state choir recognition, and looking at cheer and JROTC and things like that. Would that be an output, or would you consider that an outcome? I don't know, but I did feel like it was upside down. I didn't like when it felt like it was all inputs, but at the same time, I don't know if that's wrong, right? If that's what we should be doing. I don't know. I just felt like I wanted it to be more of the outcome side.
I picked the same one as you. Just, I mean, the first thing that jumped out at me is the Sudler Award thing for band. You know, because we experienced that at Vista, and so it just sort of jumped out at me. So that's the one I picked. But I think having a healthy balance between the input, the output, gives us the outcome, right? So there's work to be done, and we know we have to do it, and then there's, you know, all of that input stuff that we have to do in order to get the outcomes that we want. But being able to have those meetings and have those recognitions and those discussions and those rah-rahs are really great. And that's the reason I picked pre-COVID as well.
I am curious, do you think we need more input and output discussion to be able to generate an outcome, right? If when I think about what we're required to do statutorily and all the work that actually goes around Board of Trustees conversations, I think Anna was talking about it, right? Core beliefs. It's a huge discussion, right? If we spent all of our time just looking at one measurement of student outcomes, or two or three, and not talking about our core beliefs and how we're trying to impact that, that wouldn't balance out either. So I do wonder if you do need some of those input outputs, and can you take out some of the statutorily responsible duties that we have to do when you're trying to really look at this, and how do you best balance?
It's a good point. I don't know that, I mean, you can either adjust your expectations or the way you count. It doesn't really matter to me which approach you take. It produces the same result. I do think, though, as I listen to your comments, Trish, I feel increasingly the importance of striking some balance, because while as a board, I would expect a majority of our time or more time to be spent on inputs, because that's where we are. That's what we do. But in order for us to be effective in doing that, we have to spend enough time on the outcomes and on the outputs for us to be able to make good decisions and good choices around the inputs. And so I think that's where potentially not spending enough time or energy on one aspect of this set of elements may hinder us in our ability to be effective in things that we may focus more of our time on.
I'd like to hear board members' thoughts on a couple of things. So the difference between outcomes and outputs, and also then, and I want to think about that with two specific examples, but then also the difference between student outputs or student outcomes and system outputs or system outcomes, right? Because I think those two things are different too. So if on the February 20th, the pre-COVID agenda, item 6 was the taper report, which produces a very quantitative set of outputs for our student performance at a system level. And then I want to go back to that TMEA All-State Choir piece, because I think that tells us a lot of the skills that show up on our graduate profile, kids have to have in order to have accomplished that level of performance at an individual student level, right? So we know the number of students, whoever these students were, individuals, have accomplished some level of performance in a lot of these things with character development and personal growth and expression and social awareness and contribution and effective, productive, lifelong learning in order to become a TMEA All-State Choir, member. And then at the same time, the taper report tells us in aggregate the academic performance of the system, but I'm not sure what it tells us about individual students. So I'm interested to hear other members' thoughts about those things.
So I can just kind of comment on the number B on there is the TMEA All-State Band. So that is like the pinnacle of a band performance. That is a pinnacle of a musician to be able to achieve. It is hard, and especially in the state of Texas, especially in Central Texas. So I can tell you that the students that reached that achievement absolutely would have had to have some of those things that you just described in order to be able to get to that level. It's not something that just happens. And so, and I'm sure choir is the same. I'm not as familiar with that just because I'm not a choir parent, but that taper report, I'm curious, does that basically, I'm not familiar with it. So it's an academic standard kind of test show? I mean, it's a result?
Yeah, so I mean, it takes our STAR results and aggregates them in a number of different ways, but not at the student level, rather at the system level. So by grade level or by campus or by district.
So that seems very broad to me and doesn't really give us a very good way to, get a quantitative measure of its individual student performance. It's going to give you a bigger picture. And the fact that we're a 200 square mile district, I mean, that's gigantic.
So I remember that presentation, and what caught my eye was how low our scores were for special education. I'm embarrassed, I'll be honest with you. And I feel like and again, this is just me looking in, we don't talk about that because I feel like we don't want to admit that population of our students, I just don't feel like we challenge them or we don't give them the opportunity to be challenged. They preconceived notions of, well, this is how they are and this is the path they're going to go on. So for me, I remember sitting in this, probably over there, and just it wasn't even discussed during that conversation. Special education was not even mentioned. So for me, and I see these, all-state band, and, what about those other kids that fall in this category? They're not going to have that opportunity because we've already set the bar up here for them and we're not coming down to their level. So it goes back to having the individual education plans for everybody and understanding where our students are at. But I think also as a district, we need to acknowledge these numbers and not stand behind them.
Oh, I am Trish. That's funny. Trish, every time I hit the mic button, I think you're hitting the mic button. So I turn off my mic button so that I can let you speak. I was like, gosh, Trish and I keep trying to talk at the same time all night. That is so funny. Dr. Geary and I just looked at each other because he realized what I was doing. We both laughed. For me, looking at the TAPER report, I really thought of that more as an outcome, but it wasn't a student outcome because it was so broad. It was like other system outcome, you know, and then thinking about the recognitions, are those, I don't know if where we would we all consider those outcomes, or would we consider those outputs at various pieces? I don't know. I changed mine a few times, you know, of which, and then do you go through each type of recognition and say, well, this is more an outcome, student outcome, and no, maybe this one is an output. So I do think that varies on your own perception of, you know, it is very individual, and I think I sat here and I changed mine back and forth a few times. So
Yeah, I think as we continue to discuss and we kind of get calibrated about what these words mean and how we're going to use them together and what they mean in the TEA training and that system, I think kind of connecting that with some of our prior conversation on similar topics, I see outputs as leading measures. They're during the system while we're in process that tells us whether we're on track or off track. Outcomes are lagging measures. The period's closed. It's a question of whether we hit our targets or not, right? So that's how I see the difference between outputs and outcomes. And then I guess inputs is all the other stuff, right?
I'm curious, Erin, when you look at this data, because I was thinking about this data too, which I know I'm taking us off a little bit, but I was looking at our mid-year, beginning of year, end of year. Would you consider beginning of year, mid-year an output and our end of year an outcome? Or since they're still in the middle of their academic career with us, is that still, and I'm just curious where everyone felt on that, because I was looking at that thinking, well, I don't know if I consider that an outcome because they're still a student. I struggled with that.
The same data point could be either an input or an output or an outcome, depending on what it is you're trying to measure, right? So in your example, if you're measuring student growth during a particular academic year, then the pre-assessment is an input. It's the baseline. The periodic assessments, mid-year or whenever, are outputs that tell us about progress, and then the end of year is the outcome. So that's the simplest example. But if we're looking at a multi-year objective where we're trying to help our freshmen do something by the end of their senior year, then where they are at the end of their freshman year is still an output on the way to that longer term objective. So I think it just depends on what it is you're trying to measure or what it is you're trying to accomplish, what your goal is, as to what role different data points may play in the conversation.
Thank y'all very much. It was a great conversation. And like I said from the beginning, there are no answers. There is no right or wrong on this one. This is truly where you as a board get to decide what matters to you, and then how do you spend your time. And I think you all bring up some very valid points about just understanding and calibrating what do we believe, and then of course set our board agenda so that we're having those conversations. So I'm actually going to click through a few because y'all are that advanced class that jumped on up ahead for me, which is great. So Mr. Johnson mentioned this a second ago, and so so when we talk about assessments, there's different types of assessments, and these are very familiar to all of you, formative, interim, summative. And I think Mr. Johnson just gave a great example of one assessment could be formative if you're measuring a certain piece of it, but then later on it could be an interim, or it could be, so that's just something that, again, part of the TEA training, just wanted to go through there. So really looking at when we are assessing student outcomes, we cannot use any single measure ever, right? We're going to have measures at the beginning of the cycle. How are the students when they walked into our classroom, into our grade level, into our district? Along the way, how are we measuring progress? That could be within a unit, on a particular TEAC, on a certain objective, or it could be at semester. There's so many different ways to measure that. And then, of course, summative, which could be a final exam. It could be a STAR assessment. It could be, there's so many different assessments. But I think the point is exactly what you talked about. There's no single assessment that's going to show you how a student is performing and are we getting to that particular outcome. So there has to be multiple measures. Y'all's conversation around qualitative and qualitative also validates this, and so I appreciate that. So that's really what that one is. And the next one talks about the importance of having a monitoring calendar. And so I know y'all talk about this as a board, right? What data do we want to look at throughout the year? Previously, we had a very structured system where we brought superintendent performance goals. Lately, it's been looking a little different. I was thinking back to the last couple of meetings, and I know in November, Dr. Benz and Mrs. Collins came, and they brought the early reading inventory data. And we shared that with you all and had a great conversation, and we'll be talking about that in just a little while, right? What does that data mean? And what does it tell us right now in the system? Ms. Grissom came to you this fall and talked about the district improvement plans, and that's kind of on an annual calendar. We talk about district and campus improvement plans, and so that's something you look at as a board. And then, of course, Ms. Cogburn comes, seems almost every single month and gives some sort of financial update. And so when you're talking about that board calendar, it's not necessarily going to always be just student outcomes. It's all of those inputs that you all said that are so important that build the system, right? Do we have enough bus drivers? Are we fully staffed at the custodial level? All of these inputs that are going to help us ultimately achieve our outcomes. And so all of these presentations are going to help you as a board of trustees monitor the outcomes that you've set for our district. And I think the big takeaway from this one is that whatever we decide to set, whatever you all decide to set as student outcome goals, is that they are collaborative and that you have identified those non-negotiables in there. And really that comes through conversations like you're having tonight, conversations that you had around your core beliefs. I think back to a couple of board meetings ago where you all had a beautiful conversation around the word mastery, right? And I think we were here for an hour, maybe an hour and a half around a single term, and we had 3 different people chime in, and it was so beautiful. And so that right there is what it's about, and that's where the power in your governance team comes in, is just truly taking the time to say, kind of like Dr. Gearing did, what does that mean to you, right? What is that conversation about? What does that word really mean? So, all right. I'm about to get us to a break, I promise. So back to this DOT. Y'all had a great talk earlier about student outcomes. I'm curious where you fall right now and if you've changed your DOT at all, and if Michi's going to share with us this time. I'm just curious what your thoughts are and if you had any change of minds. Michi, that was great. Thank you. Yay. All right, thank you. And I know we've been here for an hour and 10 minutes, and I don't know about you, but I can only sit for so long. But before we go, if you'd kind of tell me where you are. Laura Lynn, I'm totally lost. I have no idea what we're talking about. I'm doing okay, or you can keep on going. So just kind of give me a quick check for where you are. Whew, that makes me feel good. Thanks. Let's make sure this part's recorded for everybody to see here. So if y'all are okay, Mrs. Bodie and Dr. Delakia, could we take a quick break, or y'all need a quick break in here? I'll let y'all determine how long. 10 minutes. Okay, great.
let's go ahead and get started.
All right, welcome back. So now that we've spent a little bit of time talking about outcomes and inputs and outcomes, what we want to really go into now is a little bit more into the accountability. And so we know that what gets measured gets done. And so just as you set outcome goals for our district as a board of trustees, our state also has expectations for our students and our schools at the state level. And we know that feedback loops are going to inform this and help us get better. We also know that parents and, of course, other taxpayers in our district deserve to know how the schools are doing. We talk about that often, right? The economic impact of that on our community and how our schools are doing. And we know that our accountability system will help us set that focus and set some goals. And so the next portion of the training that we're going to look at are things that we're probably very familiar with, but they're the TEKS, the STAR, and then the accountability system at the state. And so, for those of you who may not be educators or may not have had an experience with TEKS, really this is what we call the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. And so these are expectations for students. These are the minimum that every child in Texas systems deserve to know and should be able to do so that they can be prepared for success in college, career, or the military. So we're going to go through an example here in just a second. This is a third grade math example. So this is TEKS math from third grade. So take a deep breath. I see some of you getting ready, right? Here we go. And so in this particular TEK, the student is asked to apply mathematical process standards so that they can analyze and create patterns and relationships. And so the student is expected to represent 1- and 2-step problems involving addition and subtraction of whole numbers up to 1,000 using pictorial models, number lines, and equations. So as a parent and a community member, why would families need their child or want their child to be able to know how to do this? And anyone can jump out there.
I assume you're all being quiet, not because it's a hard question.
I didn't ask you to solve
Seems
it.
like this skill is something that we would like our students to leave our system with.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. I'm not asking you to do math, but you're right. It seems like something that we would want our students. Yeah. No, not a trick question, I promise. Exactly. So then how can we know whether our students have gained mastery of specific types of knowledge and skills listed in the TEKS? And so in the state of Texas, as you're very familiar, we use an assessment called the State of Texas Assessments of Academic Readiness. Again, this is one measure of academic readiness, but it's a portion of the training that we're going to be covering tonight. So please hear me that when I talk through this is not the only way that we assess student academic mastery or performance by any means. It's just one that's required tonight. So really what we know about the STAR is that it's going to measure, or it's intended to measure, the extent to which students have learned and are able to apply the knowledge and skills as defined in the TEKS for that particular grade and subject and course. So when we go back to the example from earlier, the 3.5, looking at that particular math example, here's a STAR question that would be aligned to that, right? And I will let you kind of read through that. I'm not going to ask you to do the math, I promise. Just read through that one. This actual STAR question. And so I think you'll probably see alignment there, right, between what the state is expecting of the student in TEK 3.5A and then what the STAR question. So the way the test is designed is that that STAR question would then demonstrate whether or not the student has mastered that particular TEK in third grade on a math test. All right. So we know that STAR is designed for these specific reasons, right, to measure student mastery of the TEKs of that particular grade level or course. Example, the one we gave a few minutes ago with math. We know that the STAR is not designed as a formative assessment. We talked about that earlier, right? The STAR is at the very end. It tells us how the student performed on that particular day based on those TEKs from that year. It does not describe a child's worth or value. We know that the STAR test is definitely TEKs based, the way it was designed. We know that it's criterion referenced. We're looking specifically at TEKs. And we know that it's a summative evaluation. And again, I'm not here tonight to talk about whether the STAR is good or bad. It is what it is. It is the state assessment that we have been asked to use by Texas Education Agency, and it is one measure that's within our system. So when the students take the STAR assessment, they can receive one of 4 levels. And so these are the levels here on the board. They could receive masters, meets, approaches, or did not meet grade level. Every individual test is assessed this way, and so students will receive this. And the way the STAR test is designed, as you know, is that if a student earns a label of master's grade level, there's about a 75% chance that that student will have post-secondary readiness without some sort of additional remediation. And then, of course, the meets grade level is 60%. So that's what we're looking at whenever we get this data back, both as parents and as educators. And so the way the STAR test is aligned is that there should be, ideally, the design of it is that there is alignment from post-secondary readiness. This particular example on the board shows English 3, and that it's backwards designed back down to grade 3. So ideally, what the students are learning in grade 3 is built upon in grade 4, 5, and so on, all the way up to the point where they've been able to master all of those TEKS and are then ready for post-secondary, college, career, or military readiness. So that's the intent of the design of the STAR. And again, I am not an expert on this, but I'm happy to answer any of your questions. So what I'd like to do tonight is I've handed you some data, and Mrs. Bodie and Mr. McKay, I believe you have the links as well. And again, really tonight, just looking at, this is an interesting year because we did not have STAR in 2020. So I will tell you right now, the data you're looking at is from 2019, the STAR data. So please make sure you note that. The graduation and what we call CCMR data, college, career, military readiness data, is also from 2019 because this is a very much a lag measure. When students graduate, it takes a full year for that to come into our accountability system. So I apologize that the data is a little bit outdated, but we just didn't have any STAR. The other data that I was able to get pulled is what we call our Isip data, so iStation data. And I put cohort in quotes because my friends in the assessment department wanted to make sure everybody knew this was not a pure cohort, but rather students who were in Leander ISD at that time. And so the one that has yellow highlighting across the top, you'll see these are current 3rd grade students in Leander ISD. And you have data there from when they were in kindergarten with us, and then 1st grade, 2nd grade, and then through the beginning of the year in 3rd grade is what we have. The blue will show you current 4th graders, and the green page will show you current 5th graders. And so really what I'd like to do at this time is just give you a chance just to kind of look through it. And Dr. Delakia talked about this earlier, right? What do you see? What do you notice? What jumps out at you? What questions do you still have? And then how would you as a board of trustees use this data, and what conversations could you engage in? So I'm going to let y'all just kind of take it from here.
What struck out to me the most was, I think, we knew looking at these cohort data that the 2021 data, we were going to see some plateaus or some dips, right, based on everything that's happened, over the past year. But what was really striking was looking at that percentage drop at the beginning of the year for our Black students across where all of our students, it's either about the same from beginning of year 1920 to 2021, or down 1 percentage, 2 percentage points, 3 percentage points. But looking at that 5th grade, our Black students are down 7 percentage points. And so it's a significant drop. If we look at our 4th grade, it's kind of along the same lines. It's either plus 1 or 2 percentage points, but our Black students are at -4%. So I guess for me, I look at this and what are we going to do for these students? How are we going to help the student population? That's a significant drop. And what are we doing to specifically address that with that student population? In terms of board work, it takes me to, and I know I'm probably jumping ahead on you, and I'm sorry, the other handout you gave us which is, the equity indicators. But in terms of equity, it's a lot of times folks will say, well, it's your eco-dis population. And that's why we're seeing this reduction, on this population. But our Black students, it's significantly more than our eco-dis population. So it's not simply an eco-dis situation. This is very specific to our Black student population. So I guess for me, I think of, what are we going to do as a board to address that with our Black student population? And in terms of equity indicators, I think this really shows that we need to do more in terms of diversity and equity, and this is where having an equity audit and having an equity office would really focus on these issues that are very specific to diversity and equity.
Gloria, I want to make sure I'm following you because we just received this data tonight, and I want to make sure I'm understanding from your comments what you're pointing to. Are you looking at the 4th page, or are you looking at the 5th grade page?
I got them all out of order here. Oh, so I looked at the 4th grade and the 5th grade and the 3rd grade, but the 3rd grade there wasn't a significant difference. So those percentages that I mentioned was specific to 4th grade and 5th grade cohort in the ISIP history, and looking specifically at the beginning of year from 1920 to beginning of year 2021.
Okay. Just making sure I'm following exactly your analysis of the data, right? Because as I look at 5th grade, the first thing I see and it's unique to 5th grade versus the 3rd or 4th grade cohorts, is the significant decline beginning of year for all 5th graders in all categories. Just look at those charts visually on the far right, right? They're all dropping off somewhat precipitously for beginning of year this year, which is unique to me. That's my first observation, is there's a high degree of consistency in all of those charts. And it's different from the 4th grade or the 3rd grade charts.
I'm looking at those charts, and that's a question I had. So, like at the very top one, Dr. Ardberry, perhaps you can help me with this. So I see that in the very top category, just for LISD, beginning of year 4th is 78, and beginning of year 5th is 78, but the chart shows like a significant drop. And so I see a drop on all of these, but when I calculated the difference in percentage from beginning of year to year, I don't see a significant drop in any of those except for our Black students.
I see the same thing, and I was going to follow up on that one because you're exactly right. 78 to 78 should not show such a decline. So I apologize. I will follow up on that particular column right there. The data itself is, I know, right in there. I don't know why that chart looks like that. I apologize for that.
Well, it has to be more than just those beginning of year data points, because if you look at the contour, the shape of those charts, there's more than 4 data points there, right? And so there's something else going on there, I guess. So I think getting to that is important. I think to your overall point, it's something that I've been concerned with for a long time. I think the 4th page shows this pretty clearly. If we look at the column for our Black students, we see a lot of red. Similar for our economically disadvantaged students, less so, but same pattern for Hispanic students. And those are areas that have been a concern for some time, but I don't know that at a board level we've really talked about what to do about those things. And I don't know that we necessarily even have a theory on why those things are happening, right? So I think before we start prescribing solutions to those clear problems, I think I want to make sure we understand what's driving those problems. And one of the questions that I would like to understand better is, what's the experience for our Black students, our Hispanic students? our economically disadvantaged students over time? Are they entering the system behind and staying behind? Are they entering the system behind and beginning to catch up, or what does that experience look like? I think as we assess that and start to develop a theory about what's going on, then I think we're able to effectively consider solutions to address it. I think it's hard to prescribe a solution at this stage just based on the data for me.
Absolutely. I'm not prescribing any solution other than we need to really dive deep into this, and that's where I mentioned that equity audit. So someone could really dive deep into that data and get all of that data points to look at our students' experience from kindergarten to high school. So I agree that it does require a really deep dive into that.
And I guess for me, going back, I'm looking at this and, our Black students, I guess for me, it's like, what are we doing to make sure that they are getting the help that they need? Like, we see their scores are not improving. So I guess for me, I'd like to see the breakdown for, are these students getting intervention services? Are they getting, are they getting down that right path? Like, I guess for me, it's like, granted, this is COVID, but just seeing these numbers spanned over 3 years, I feel like we saw the problem, then why didn't we go ahead and start intervention services? Why didn't we start making the progress to help close that gap? So I would be curious to know, like, the breakdown of race in regards to intervention and services if they're looking for it.
Dr. Atterbury?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious too. This is one data point, and so it raises other questions. I would really like to have a more robust understanding of what this means that we're looking at. So like in the third grade students, our eco-DIS students have a tremendous gap in kindergarten from our non-eco-DIS, and that kind of goes across. You see that happen. Why is there that tremendous? Are we saying they came in so low, so we're never going to catch them up? Why did that happen? What are the wraparound services, or what are the? I'm just trying to figure out what other data points we need to help us really understand this better before we can even get to saying what's happening. I think there might need to be more information around it. The same thing with our Black students. There was no change in the Isip history on current third grades in, what year was it? I looked at the number, it's the second graders for Black students, beginning of year was 57%, middle of year was 57%. I would love to know, when we see that happen, what happened, right? When eco-DIS goes down in their second grade, your eco-DIS population, they were at 60% in the middle of the year, but went down to 58%. So it's those numbers as I'm trying to understand a better picture of what is happening to cause these, I don't know, seismic shifts, changes, and truthfully that gap that we're seeing between the non-eco-DIS, the eco-DIS, and all of our student subpopulations.
I also would like to, for me to get a better understanding is, I noticed that there's no special education category on here. And I know, at least from my child's own experience, iStation is just not visual or friendly for us. So I feel like, and I know from other special education parents, that this is just not the right tool for their child. So for me, I look at these scores and I feel like some of these scores are skewed because of that fact. So I was wondering, like, is there another option? And I've asked this question before, like, how can we make sure that we're providing an assessment to these children that is going to benefit them? Because I know my own student, when he gets frustrated with the iStation and will just push. But when it's time to take a test, we're excelling. So like, what are we doing there? Like, I'd like to see those numbers because I see it broken down over here, but it's not here. So that's what I'd like to see.
Y'all bring up some.
I'm going to apologize for this.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was going to say I'm going to apologize for this comment ahead of time, but to Gloria's point, we've seen these numbers before, and here we are again asking, well, how can this be and what's going on? But yet we have so many in our community that come before the board and tell us exactly what's going on. And again, going back to Gloria's point, the time for trying to put a plan in place to address this is long come and gone. We really need an equity audit. We need to have an outside agency come in, take a look, give us this equity audit, and just tell us point blank where it is that we have areas of opportunity. If we're not going to listen to our constituents that come before us every time we have a board meeting, right? These numbers are nothing new. We've seen these numbers year over year over year. If we're going to impact student outcomes, especially in this area, we've got to get that equity audit going.
I agree with Jim and
I'm
Gloria.
curious, when you say equity audit, what are you looking? Is it special education we're talking about? Are all of our subpopulations and our ecodisc and our English language learners? I'm curious, when you say equity audit, what do the trustees mean when they say that? Or what are they at? I just want to make sure we're all on the same page.
So for me, an equity audit addresses all of them. Where are our special education community in relation to the whole? Where are our minority and historically underserved populations as a percentage of the whole? Even within economically disadvantaged, and I think Anna touched on this, we have economically disadvantaged, and then we have low numbers in Black students as well. What crossover is there? How many of the Black student numbers are also economically disadvantaged? There's no way to flesh that out in this graph. So we can get as granular as need be, but we do need, when I'm talking about an equity audit, we need to be able to clearly identify where our subpopulations are as a relationship to the whole, and what interventions we need to put in place immediately to start addressing this.
When I talk about an equity audit, it is all of those things that Jim mentioned. It's also looking at our student populations that are in Quest courses, looking at student population that is in our AP classes, that are in our higher level engineering and math classes. It's looking at our students that are participating in different types of electives. It's also looking at disciplinary reports and looking at students that have been reported for different issues. It's looking at all of those issues, and some of it is quantitative, and then there's also, with a lot of these different audits, equity audits that we've looked into, there's also a qualitative piece where they go out and they spend time on our campuses and they talk to our students and our families of color and talk to them about their experience. I've also seen in an equity audit where they address some of the things that Mr. Johnson mentioned, where they're looking at a student's experience from kindergarten to the end and looking at what happened, and then talking to those families and those students about their journey through that. And, looking at this data in terms of, they're really inspecting all of this data with that lens of, okay, well, if we started at pre-K, or we started at kindergarten and our eco-disc was at this and our non-eco-disc was here and our Black population was here, and we can see we've made up ground here, but then at this point, when they got to middle school, then we went back down. They're able to analyze, that's what they do, right? They're analyzing all of that data and looking for where are those junctions, where are those breaks, where are those gaps. And so when I talk about an equity audit, it's all of those things.
Right, and quite honestly, to Gloria's point, we don't know what we don't know. The firms that specialize, that's their, they are the subject matter experts in all things equity. I think it's foolhardy for us to say, well, here's what we want to look at. They should be telling us what the full spectrum is relative to equity, right? To Tricia's point, what does equity mean? We need the experts to come in and tell us, take a holistic look at our district and say, here's where we need to make improvements.
I'm going to make a point that may sound like I'm trying to contradict you, Jim. I'm not. That's not really my goal. I do want to present an opposing point of view for the purpose of clarifying our role as trustees and our responsibility to our community. I don't think that an equity audit is necessarily a bad thing, but I personally think we need to own what it is we're doing in Leander ISD, not outsourcing what we should be doing to a consulting firm. At the end of the day, it's going to be incumbent on us to implement it and to make it effective. And I think it is our responsibility to be a little bit prescriptive about what it is we want to accomplish. And I think we ultimately, this board, need to have a really strong handle on the data and on the issues, the core issues behind the data, so that we can give direction to the administration about how to go about resolving this. That's not to say we have to have all the answers, but at the same time, I don't want to simply turn over the keys and find out 3 or 5 years later, after we've implemented all of the recommendations from the consultants, that nothing's changed. I'm not going to be satisfied with that result, and neither will our community be. And so I want to be careful that we don't simply outsource this and wash our hands. I think we have to stay closely involved, and we have to direct how this is to be done and make sure that it's focused on the things that we think matter most to us and to our community. So again, not trying to contradict you, Jim, but wanted to clarify a couple of things that I think are important as we do this.
And quite honestly, Aaron, I agree with what you say, and I don't see that as a contradiction at all. You've been on the board far longer than I have, right? And knowing you like I know you, the numbers that we see on page 4 are unacceptable to you. They're unacceptable to me. They're unacceptable to everybody on the board. How many years have we been prescriptive in trying to, and we call it the achievement gap, right? How many years have we been working to close the achievement gap, and yet this data looks us in the face and says we're not doing it? So I don't want to outsource the solution, but I want to bring in an outside agency to help us, just like Ms. Arterberry tonight is an outside source facilitating TEA training to help us focus the conversation. That's what I'm looking at in terms of an equity audit. I don't expect them to take this and fix it for us and then hand it to us with a bow. But what I do expect is them to be able to present some hard truth about areas that we're falling short in servicing our historically underserved and economically disadvantaged and special education communities.
Just to follow up on that, I don't see it as outsourcing solutions. It's hiring an agency, just like we just passed someone to do that for our technology. We hired an agency to come in and review our entire technology system, and then to come back with some proposals, some suggestions of what we might do. We've done this exact same thing for special education. We hired an outside agency that came in and talked to our families, inspected our process, looked through everything, and then came back with some recommendations and suggestions for our special education department. And so this would be in no way saying, hey, we hired this agency, go fix it. It would be more an agency that we would hire to do some research, look through that data, and come back with some suggestions, come back with some data for us to look through as a board and with our community and with our administration. Very similar to how we've done before with special education, technology, and different services like that.
And the way, I'm going to be blunt here, but I feel like we've known about these numbers. So why are we just going to keep kicking the can down the road? Like, honestly, I see this 0% for percentage of graduating classes and top percent for special education. How long has that been 0%? Like, that is unacceptable. And so for me, And I understand what you're saying, Aaron, because I think we have to be very careful when we're having someone come in and do an equity audit, because it is our community. They have to understand how our community operates and what our community is about. But at the same time, I'm sitting here and I'm looking at this 0%, and I'm like, well, how long have we known about this 0%? Why haven't we done anything to prevent this? What are we doing to those students? How many students are we losing right now that we haven't caught? So I guess for me, like, I'm full board 100% for an equity audit. I think we need it.
To be clear, just to clarify, I'm not suggesting that by hiring a firm to do an equity audit that we're outsourcing the resolution of our problem. We're not. I'm saying we're outsourcing the strategy portion because we're asking them to come back to us with a set of recommendations, and based on the way that we've historically done this, from the recommendations we get from other professionals, we begin adopting those recommendations. And I'm saying we need to be very prescriptive in terms of how we task them so that they bring us back recommendations, but we also need to recognize that we own which recommendations we choose to implement and how, and that we need to be the ultimate authors of that strategy. So that was my only point, not to suggest that in hiring a firm that we would be outsourcing either the implementation or the execution, but there could be a tendency to outsource the strategy component. And I just want us all to look each other in the eye and say, 3 or 5 years from now, when we look back on this, we can't blame the firm. It's us, and we have to pick the strategies and we have to pick the approaches that we think are going to work, which means we've got to be invested in the data and the root cause analysis and all the stuff that goes with it. We can't simply say, hey, here's our data, we've got a problem, what do you think we should do?
Yeah, I don't think anyone was saying that. I think what you said, looking back 3 or 5 years, saying, you know, what did we do? I'm looking back 3 or 5 years right now and saying, what did we do? We did nothing. We've done nothing for a long time. And
I think that's unfair to our administration. I hope you'll investigate that further and see that that's not entirely true.
We haven't done enough to move the needle on these items here. And I don't mean that as a reflection. I think we've known, and Dr. Arterberry and I are both in the diversity and equity group, and so we've talked a lot about this. And we know 3 or 5 years ago that this was an issue, and we know that we haven't done everything that we should have done to address this issue. So I don't see it as outsourcing. I see it as hiring an agency to look through this data and to come back with all of the information that they found and present something to us. And absolutely, you're right. At that point, this board will have to make some decisions based on that data, based on their recommendations, on how we want to proceed. And yeah, we'll have to, and I absolutely agree. We can't say, oh, we hired a firm, we did everything we did, we're cool now. No, it will definitely be on us.
The other thing I would mention here is these are notoriously, historically, universally difficult problems to solve. There is no silver bullet. There are no magic beans. This is really difficult work. And so I want us to be kind to the people who've come before us, who weren't blind to these challenges and frankly have been doing their level best to address them. But I think there is more that we can do, and it starts with shining a light on the data and examining the root causes. And I think it's important to note that the folks who are going to help us solve it are the same folks who are in our system and have been for the last 3 to 5 years and more. And so I think, again, this is something that we have to own together, and an equity audit can help us do that, but it's all on us, right? We really own this. Whether we ask consultants to help us solve this problem or we solve it on our own, at the end of the day, it's going to be the same work done by the same people.
Absolutely.
And I agree with that, Aaron.
have told us they want to do that work and they're ready to do that work, and they hope that they have a board of trustees that will support that work.
And I want to jump in here as well. At no point in this conversation am I looking to level blame or accountability on the failure of any past, present, future board member, administrator. It's not about blame. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about, yeah, in my own house, I think I'm pretty handy with with a pipe wrench and can do some plumbing. But at some point, when I have water 3 inches deep in my floors, I have to say, you know what? Maybe I should consult a professional who makes their livelihood understanding the problems that I'm facing. That I've given an honest effort. I just can't fix it. This is in no way about blaming anybody for failures to try to solve the issue. And you're right, Aaron. These are systemic, historical, difficult issues to tackle. That doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to put forth as much effort as we possibly can. And I know that the time that you've been on the board, the time that I've been on the board, the time that Trish has been on the board, even the short time that our newest board members have been here, we are all focused on trying to do the right thing for the greatest number of students in our district. This data tells us right now that we are continuing to miss the boat. At this point, we have to have somebody come in and give us some help. And you're right, we do own it after that.
I had a question. In the star on this page with everything, for special education, is that the star alt or is it the regular star? Or are we including both scores for that column?
That's a great question, and I'll get clarification on that.
All right, thank you.
That is a really good question. My assumption based on, you know what, I'm not even going to answer that.
Okay.
Yes.
Because, I mean, that makes a big difference
It does.
in those
Yes, ma'am.
scores. Okay,
Yes,
thank
ma'am.
you.
Yeah.
Dr. Arterberry?
Yes, ma'am.
If we could take the equity audit, which I think is a really good discussion, and I just want to put it to the side for a bit. The numbers that we're looking at are, I would say, a bit out of context in that the administration looks at them, principals look at these numbers. Y'all go through and look at data, and not just one set, you look at several different pieces of data and y'all have discussion. That's how we get the district improvement plan. But when we look at this as trustees, I'm interested in what do you recommend for capacity building? How can we bridge the difference? Because we're not cabinet, we're not the team going out and getting the in-depth information of what is really going on. Do you think an equity audit helps with this? Some of the, as discussed by Dr. Delakia and Mr. McKay tonight, the terms or the thoughts of what they thought it was an equity audit. Will that help you in y'all's discussions? Or from your discussions, what are y'all seeing? Because this is data for us to start a question, but I have so many more, and you see more data. So can you help us bridge a gap?
I will do my best. And Dr. Gehring, I'll let you jump in as well. What I was going to say about this conversation you just had is that I think it validates that there's no one single data point that's going to tell us how we're doing. And so I purposely put two pieces of data in front of you, one that was very summative, STAR data, right, state accountability, and one that's a little more current, students in our system. And you've had such a great, robust conversation around that. And so to answer your question, Mrs. Bodie, I think anytime we can put data in front of us and we can have a conversation around it, the more we're going to understand our system. Sometimes that data can be on a piece of paper and it can be in heat maps and it can look like this. Sometimes it might look like focus groups. Sometimes it looks like surveys. And so anytime we can collect data and have a bigger view of our system, I think that we're going to better understand multiple perspectives because this data that you have in front of you tells one story. But I would say that it's not indicative of our entire system by any means because it's only measuring certain pieces. Dr. Gehring.
So I think I'm going to contradict the very last thing you said. I was with you all the way until the very last thing you said. You know, I think just a couple of observations. So Edward Deming says that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. I think the second observation is that our system has historically been extremely stable over time. So it's been performing, if you look, historically, pretty similarly for a very long period of time. So what everybody has attested to tonight is that these gaps have existed and persisted over time. To Erin's point, these are very challenging problems to solve. I'll point out that the way that STAR measures student performance of the TEKS, and if you go back to that example that was in this packet earlier in the presentation on that third grade math problem, if you are not reading effectively, you can't do the math. Well, that problem measures math. However, you may be able to do that math in another context, given the right circumstances and accommodations. On this particular test, if you can't read adequately, it looks like you can't do math. If you don't understand the context of crayons for some reason, because you have a language barrier or some other issue, then you also can't be successful in demonstrating that you can do that particular math. So STAR certainly has a place, but it needs to be one data point in an overall assessment of what our students can and are able to do. Aaron said something very interesting earlier. He referenced, what does the experience look like, right? So I think what data does for us is it prompts us to ask the right questions. And that's exactly what this data is doing. It's prompting us to ask the question, what does the experience look like for these different groups of students that's causing them to perform differently on this test? And then if we're going to change the outcome or the output in this format, then we're going to have to do something different with that experience. And that's something that becomes very different to the approach that necessarily we might have taken before. I think it is important to look at lots of different data points because students have different strengths. And so when you look at a capacity matrix for a particular student, they may shine in one area, say they made TMEA or state choir, but they didn't perform well on the end of course Algebra 2 test. Well, that's possible, right? And that doesn't make that student a failure. That just says that that student is not necessarily strong in math, but may be very strong with their vocal ability, right? So how do we then take the student's strengths and work with that to make sure that they have the necessary skills that they need, because they probably do need some of those Algebra 2 skills to be successful in life. That's why that is on the curriculum. But how do we make sure that, to Anna's point, that we're getting the right accommodations in place to make sure that that student can be successful in all areas? And how do we make sure that they have a way of demonstrating that and in a performance of some kind that may not be this particular demonstration, but maybe some other way of demonstrating that they can be successful in those areas? So it is a very complex problem that is going to require a lot of conversation, both at the board level, but also at the administration level. But I do agree with all of you that it starts right here with acknowledging that this is not acceptable. And we have to own that and say, now what are we going to do about it?
And I can tell you in a couple of weeks when Ms. Carlene and I come back up here, Dr. Dolakia, you mentioned maybe some other data, who's involved in what. Tonight we're looking at performance data, because that's really what the training is more about, right? That student outcome piece. When we come back in 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at access data. And so we're going to be sharing some more data with you all that's similar format, but really looking at which students are accessing which programs. And so we'll be able to continue that conversation a little bit further. So I appreciate you helping us set the stage. We're actually going to be sharing some of that in a board memo tomorrow with you, so you'll have a chance to kind of look at that data prior to the conversation. I apologize that tonight's data wasn't accessible earlier, but that is coming, and I think that it's not just, as Dr. Gehring said, that performance, that end outcome data, it's the whole system, and how is our system set up to get the outcomes that we want, and it starts with all of the conversations you're having, your core beliefs, your core values, the graduate profile, developing everything, having the conversations about what we believe in our system, and it excites me to see the work that's going on at the governance level.
And if I may just add one more thing, I think it's also important to remember, as we looked at the agendas earlier, that a lot of the work we do at this level is input, right? But that work is just as important to these outcomes and these outputs as some of the other work. So if we can't put together an adequate budget that helps provide the resources necessary, then we can't accomplish this change. If we cannot create a long-range facility plan that creates the learning spaces that match the learning we want to see in the district, then we can't accomplish these things. So sometimes we don't always have to land on the outcome in order to accomplish the result, although we have to know what that vision looks like.
All right, I'm going to move on through this, but please feel free to jump in if something else comes up and you think of another idea. Really, the next portion of the section is just to kind of give you, the training, I apologize, is to give you an overview of the accountability system at the state level. And so as we talked earlier about the STAR assessment, based on how students perform on that particular assessment, schools are, in a typical year, given a rating of A through F. We know that that is not going to occur this year, but that y'all are familiar with these labels, both as parents, community members, and of course as trustees. And so we know that our state accountability system is composed of 3 areas, and you'll see on the board here, there is 70% of the rating of A through F comes from either student achievement or school progress, and then 30% comes from closing the gaps. And again, disclaimer, Brenda Cruz is our expert on this, so please call Brenda with all the specific questions. So the first thing we'd like to look at is student achievement, and how do we get that score? Essentially, at our elementary and middle schools, that entire 70% comes from STAR. Right or wrong, that's where it comes from. It comes from that STAR assessment. At our high school, we do get to include college, career, military readiness indicators, as well as graduation rates. But really just, it's not something that everybody knows that when you talk about student achievement, it truly is based on the STAR assessment. So here are the indicators that the state has set up to define college readiness. And these probably look very familiar to many of you, especially if you have a student or have had a student in high school. AP, IB, dual credit, associate's degree, passing or meeting TSI criteria. We also have military ready, enlisting in the military or in armed forces. We have coherent CTE sequence, or CTE coherent sequence in there, industry-based, and so there's a lot more detail that can go into that, but those are indicators that the state looks at to determine if a student is college, career, military ready. So then there's this nice formula where everything goes together, and this is just a simple example of what it might look like. So you can see on there a total of about 3,000 tests. You can see the number of students who earned approaches, meets, and masters, and then the formula that's used by the state to get a number over there. So you'll see that 92.7% of approaches, pull that over to the side, average up approaches, meets, and masters, and you get a score. And this particular score of 60.2 converted to an A. So it's not your typical 1 to 100. There's a conversion score on there. So just wanted to kind of show you how a school would get that. So they're looking at all tests on that one. When we look at school progress, which could be, and remember it's either student achievement or school progress for 70% of the score, there's 2 ways in which a school can earn a school progress rating, and that can either be through student growth or through relative performance. So when we look at student growth, and again, this is a specific and complicated formula, so I'm going to make it as simple as I can here. Essentially, what we're looking at is we cannot get the score in 3rd grade because the student's never taken STAR previously. But we look from 3rd to 4th and from 4th to 5th, and so you're looking over a course of 2 years, did a student performance improve? So if you see the student, the orange dot right there, if they were at approaches, and then where did they go next? Did they increase? Did they stay the same level? Did they decrease? And then campuses receive a point, a half a point, or 0 points based on individual student performance. And so it's not just an aggregate of did they pass, but really looking at how did each individual student perform on that growth measure. And again, we can't do this at 3rd grade, but everywhere from 4th on up, we're able to do that. There's also a relative performance one, and this one you'll see on the axis there, you'll see the student on free and reduced lunch, And then you'll also see student achievement domain for all students. And so typically we know that campuses with less students on free and reduced lunch, or less students who qualify for free or reduced lunch, typically have higher performance of student achievement. Again, not trying to say whether it's right or wrong, but that's typically the data we see. More often whenever we have students that have schools that have more students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, the scores are typically lower. So what the state has done is kind of drawn an average line, and what we're looking for here is how do schools perform relative to more similar schools. And so what we're looking at here is if you take a school, there's these bands that the state has come up with. And so if we have a school who is, let's say 100% free and reduced lunch, but the students are performing at a very high level, then the state would consider that school as an A, because those students are going against what typically would happen. Whereas the same thing, if you have a school that has a very low percentage of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, but student academic achievement is not very high, that school would be labeled as an F or a D accordingly. So that's kind of how that relative performance works, and the state has these bands in there that they look at. And please stop me if there's any questions, or call Brenda, right? All right, closing the gaps is the last 30% of the accountability. And what this is going to look at is multiple student groups in our systems. And so you'll see some of the categories on there: students who receive special education services, English learners, students who might qualify as economically disadvantaged, multiple race ethnicity categories. That we look at students who are in and out of our system, mobility rate, students that are continuously enrolled. And so this is that closing the gap indicator on the accountability. And so we're looking at how are students in each one of these groups performing. And I think as Anna mentioned earlier, we don't want this to just get overshadowed by an all student category. We're going to look at individual student groups. And so that's where the closing the gaps indicator comes in. So really at this point, kind of closing up my portion of the training and let you continue to talk is really just what can you do as a board? And that's exactly what we talked about, right? Set those goals, create that calendar, and work with administration, work with Dr. Gearing together, and what is important to us, what is important to Leander ISD. And then as we set those board agendas, we're talking about that in here. We're talking about what matters to you, what matters to our community, and holding ourselves accountable to that. And of course, because it's TEA's training, I'm going to tell you that there are Lone Star governance workshops that you may also attend as well, because I want to make sure that gets mentioned in there. And then finally, if you have any additional questions, there are a couple of websites here you're welcome to go through and learn more about your role as a trustee. And finally, before we wrap up this portion of it, and I open it back up to Mrs. Bodie and Dr. Delakia, I'd love for you to just kind of write down, what are your takeaways from today? Some of you came in and said, I know it's required, I know a couple of things about this, but after having a really good conversation with your trustees here, what are you going to take away from this? So I'll try to scroll through these so you all can see what your takeaways were. And feel free to share if anyone has any last closing thoughts or anything you'd love to share.
I guess for me, and this is me being personal because I have a 2E kid, I feel like we are totally missing out on our 2E kids with the 0% graduating class, the top 10%. Like, I think about my own child and the hurdles that we encountered just for him to get into IB. And I see where he's at now, and I see the endless opportunities now that are open to him. So for me, and I'm trying not to be personal, but I'm thinking about all those other kids who've had that opportunity taken away from them, because we have a lot of 2E kids in our district. And so for me, that's the big thing, is we are missing out on this whole generation of students who could succeed if they were given the right tools and just soar, but we're not doing it.
I would say for me, I thought the discussion about what do we see as student outcomes on our agenda started me thinking about, why do I want to see more outcome discussions on the agenda? What I got to thinking about was, well, because I want to be able to talk about how our kids are learning in the district. And I want to be able to have that information available. And as we looked at the data points tonight, I also feel like sometimes our data is almost siloed. We can take the TAPR in one area and the update on the STAR exam in another, and then here's our iStation. But how do we really use this data to paint a story of learning? And we can't really get there, I think, until it kind of brought me full circle to saying, okay, so what does a community accountability system provide then for a district, right? Does it allow trustees to connect that dot if we can identify how we define learning and what measurements we want to see in there?
I just want to thank you all for your time this evening. Hopefully, we're able to share some information with you on state accountability, as well as the importance of your role as a governance team in setting student outcomes and working with this. So thank you all very much for your time. And Dr. Delaki, I'll turn it back over to you.
Finishing my information here. Let me just finish this thought.
Okay, Trish wants to speak
Very funny. We don't have anything else on the agenda, but we can talk about any of these other items here if anybody else would like to use this time to discuss outcomes or...
I would just like to get, if possible, like the same chart for like the last 3 years as well, so I can compare. And then also the STAR question in regards to special education. I'd like to see what students took the STAR and what took STAR Alt.
And when you ask for which students, do you want student groups or numbers?
Student groups, that's fine.
Dr. Gearing, do you have anything you'd like to add before?
No, ma'am, thank you.
Any other comments? Well, then if we have no objections, no other comments, I will now adjourn this meeting.